the spirit of healing, we want to acknowledge the original peoples of the Chicagoland area, and we want to name that Chicago has one of the largest urban Native American communities in the US. Native people are part of Chicago's past, present, and future. And as a community invested in social justice, we understand that fighting for disability justice requires dismantling settler colonialism, white supremacy, and ableism. And tonight, the overview of the program, following my introduction, Joy Young is going to give a short description of our partner for this event, Access Living. Then I will come back to celebrate our authors. Then our authors will be in conversation, and following their discussion, there's going to be some time for a Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And now I'll pass it off to Joy for an introduction to Access Living.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Joy Young. My pronouns are they, them. Visual description, I am a white genderqueer person with short, kind of messy hair in a black t-shirt and a flannel overshirt. Behind me, my background is blurred so that you cannot see my messy office. Access Living, we are a proud partner with Women and Children's First to present this series of book events highlighting the work of disabled writers. Access Living is a cross-disability organization focused on services and advocacy for people with disabilities, led by people with disabilities. Access Living's Arts and Culture project promotes innovative art, supports new and established artists with disabilities, develops new audiences, and increases public access to disability arts and culture. If you have any questions about what we do, please feel free to email me. I'm the Disability Arts and Culture Coordinator at Access Living. I'd like to take a moment to just thank our other sponsors who make events like this possible. This event is brought to you by Bodies of Work, a network of disability arts and culture. Bodies of Work is a part of the Department of Disability and Human Development within the College of Applied Health Sciences at University of Illinois, Chicago. This event is also supported by the Disability Art Activism Lab, DECAL, teaching lab housed under the Department of Art Therapy and Counseling at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Our program is partially supported by a grant from the Illinois Arts Council Agency, Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, and the National Institute on Disability, Independent, and Rehabilitation Research. If you're interested in this event, we also have an upcoming event that's going to be hosted at the Center for Mad Culture on Monday, August 12th, called Incongruent Access, a facilitated community conversation surrounding the challenges of cross-disability access in personal, professional, and communal spaces with Bree Beck and Matt Bodette. Please keep an eye out for registration. I just verified we're hosting that event today, and so I'll be announcing it on our social media, or feel free to reach out to me. My email, I'll drop it in the chat also, is jyoung@accessliving.org. Back to Sarah now to introduce our wonderful speakers for the evening. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Joy. We love everyone at Access Living and all you do. Okay, now on to the main event. Jessica Slice is a disabled author and essayist who has published essays in the New York Times Modern Love column, in Alice Long's best-selling Disability Visibility, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Hippocampus, Glamour, Cosmopolitan, and HuffPost. Her upcoming book about parenting with a disability, Unfit Parent, will be published by Beacon Press. She has been featured on Long Reads, Salika Jouad's newsletter, on Judy Human's podcast, on iHeartRadio's Love Struck, and is a regular participant on disability panels and podcasts. Thousands of monthly readers engage with her disability-related newsletter. She is a graduate of Davidson College and Columbia University and lives in Ontario with her husband and children. Caroline Cupp is an author, bioethicist, and progressive faith leader. Born with cerebral palsy, she is one of the only disabled clergy to have led a large religious congregation in the United States. Caroline's work has been featured in Reflections, the Journal of the Yale Divinity School, and Presbyterian Outlook. and she has contributed to several podcasts on the subject of faith and disability. A graduate of Davidson College, Yale Divinity School, and the University of Pennsylvania, Caroline focuses on the intersection of health, justice, and meaning making. She lives outside Philadelphia with her husband and son. Together, Jessica and Caroline have written 3 forthcoming picture books. Wow, that's a lot. All celebrating disability. That's in addition to the book we're celebrating tonight, Dateable. So please join me in welcoming Jessica and Caroline.
You're muted, Caroline.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you all tonight. We're just delighted to be here with Women and Children First with Access Living. And before I begin with a brief passage of the book, I'll just give you an image description. I'm a white, middle-aged woman with brown shoulder-length hair that's straight. And I am wearing a sort of blue and white dress and have a very blurry background so that you don't see, you're not subjected to my messy office. And with that, I will read you a brief passage from Dateable. Many of us who grew up disabled have to contend with the dual messages we receive from peers and strangers. We're both captivatingly interesting and utterly invisible. On the one hand, our bodies are objects of curiosity, invitations for comments that suggest we're alien beings on some kind of intergalactic exchange program. My 5-year-old neighbor popped into the room the other day and instructed me to get 2 good nights of sleep so the back wouldn't be twisted anymore. And honestly, that's some of the better advice I've gotten from random people over the years. Many of us are prepared for strangers to offer to pray over us, ask us intrusive questions about our health, or grab our arms if they feel like we could use their assistance. The flip side is that we can go from way too visible to utterly invisible in a hot minute. Disability rights activist Judy Heumann spoke about a time in college when a guy asked her if she knew any girls who were free that evening and interested in going on a date. He was looking right at her, this person who was clearly both a woman and sitting in a dorm room with no discernible plans. And because she was using a wheelchair, didn't clue into the fact that she was exactly the available single female student he was looking for. Judy was so blindsided by the blatancy of her erasure that she said nothing in response. But the gut-punching impact of that moment was still fresh when we talked about it years later. She described herself in the eyes of her fellow students as a kind of non-sex, someone who was presumed to have no interest in dating or having a partner, though that was not at all the case. My husband, who also has CP, put this slightly differently. It's like there's dating and friend zoned, and then way over here, there's this other category of disabled people who are off on our own. In other words, we're crip zoned. There are no romantic comedies where we cast off our crutches or don't, get a makeover, and then suddenly become portrayed as desirable. There were plenty of times over the years when I wondered whether some guy I was friends with would have asked me out had I not used a motorized scooter to cruise the high school hallways. And based on our conversations with other disabled people, this wondering seems pretty widespread. One woman with CP said that in high school, her sister always had boyfriends, while she had platonic guy friends, and she wondered how much of that was about her disability. She also had the sense that things would get easier as she and her potential partners grew up. I knew that as I got older and people matured, things might be different. I'd meet someone who would see me, see my beauty. If someone doesn't love you for who you are, they're not the right person.
Thanks, Caroline. I just was struck by how amazing it is to all be here talking about disabled dating. When Caroline and I thought about writing this book, it was because we had both felt so lonely in that time. And I just think it's really cool that we're all here talking about it. I'm Jessica, and my visual description is I'm a 41-year-old woman with shoulder length brown hair, dark glasses, a navy dress with white flowers on it. I'm sitting on a green chair and there's like walls and pillows behind me. And then the section I'm reading is from the part of the book about breakups, which I think was one of there were so many powerful sections, but it was one of the more powerful ones for me to work on. It's page 98. Most of the disabled people we interviewed shared heart-rending and complicated breakup stories. Harriet's story is hers alone, but the themes are common in disabled relationships. Harriet lives in LA, where she is a well-known and highly sought-after disability fashion influencer. She didn't make it to the end of her first date with her former partner, Kyle, before she sensed the first red flag, self-loathing. But despite her bold and confident public persona, her internalized ableism prompted her to override her initial concerns. Harriet is visibly disabled, and Kyle, who has a learning disability, presents as non-disabled. Harriet is a wheelchair user, and without the chair, her mobility is quite limited. Kyle was large, and the first time they had sex, she was acutely aware of her physical vulnerability. And that was when the second red flag started waving. Kyle was turned on by physical domination and sexual assault fantasies. Her fear intensified when, after a few months together, Kyle's anger issues began to emerge. Harriet tried to break things off, but he convinced her to stay, and in the months that followed, they solidified a dynamic that many disabled people find familiar. Kyle treated Harriet like a burden. Harriet admits that in public and on social media, she loved having a partner who did not publicly identify as disabled. She felt like if it offered proof of her worthiness and reinforced her social posts about disabled people being sexually desirable. But when they were alone, the relationship was corrosive. Kyle's anger and insecurities festered, and Harriet always knew they couldn't be together long term. He blamed her for not being able to stay in his inaccessible apartment, and she was often afraid. Sometimes he was kind, but inevitably he would hold those moments over her head. Because Kyle's relationship with his own identity was so fraught, he resented Harriet's disability advocacy. She knew she should leave him, but admits now that she didn't want to because of her own internalized ableism. While she publicly shares messages about disabled worth, internally she worried she would never find someone else. She also knew she wanted a partner and didn't want to endure another round of dating app humiliation. In her head, she repeated, "I'll put up with this because he's putting up with me." Harriet and Kyle met in 2017, and in 2022, she finally insisted on some time apart. During their break, she started to be honest with her parents and close friends about how she had been treated. Understandably, the people who loved her encouraged her to end things for good, which she did. She is thankful to be single now and feels committed to never again sticking around and accepting unsafe treatment. When asked what she would tell other disabled people about dating and breakups, she said, "Never cheapen yourself because of your disability. Don't override your own needs to prove something to people. Being in a healthy relationship just to prove you can be in any relationship isn't worth it."
Thank you so much for reading those powerful passages. Um, Now let's dive into the conversation. Can you two talk a little bit about the origin story of Dateable? How did you two first connect, and then what inspired you to write this book, and along with your other picture books as well?
Sure. So Jessica and I met in college. We both went to Davidson down in North Carolina, and we knew each other a bit, but not we didn't know each other well. But through the magic of Facebook, we had stayed somewhat connected over the years, at least through that medium. And my son was about 3, and I was looking for a book that had not only disabled children in it, he's non-disabled, but disabled parents. And I couldn't find anything. And I had followed Jessica's career as she was writing all of these amazing things about disability, and messaged her and said, "Hey, do you know any books where parents have disabilities?" And she said, "No, but let's write one." And so we ended up writing, starting on this journey of writing picture books for around the subject of disability. But in the course of this and many conversations, we would sometimes talk about, or maybe a lot talk about, remember life before kids. Like, do you remember this time before, Costco was, a big night out? And when we were out there and dating and meeting people and meeting the people that we eventually partnered with. And we, doing that, we, should write a book about dating with a disability. And we thought, well, that's got to exist somewhere, right? And so we looked and it didn't, which was kind of shocking. And so we thought, maybe we could write that. And maybe we could write it using the same format, which we did for our picture books, which was not just based on our own experiences, but by interviewing many, many, many people who have disabilities and chronic illnesses and asking them about their experiences. So how this book came about then was reaching out to dozens and dozens of people with all different kinds of backgrounds, all different kinds of disabilities, all different kinds of chronic illnesses, different goals and preferences around relationships and intimacy and all kinds of things. And so we used those conversations to craft this book that sort of gleans wisdom and through lines from this incredible disabled community. So that's sort of how it came about. And now all I want to do is talk to disabled people about their dating lives because it is an endless source of joy and delight and interest. So
Yeah. And so this book is coming out before the picture book, right? That you wrote together.
yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to clear that.
Yeah, so we have one coming out. So through the magic of picture books, when you don't have illustrations, things come out a lot faster. So we've got some great illustrators that we're working with, but the picture books are coming out fall and then next year. So this was the first one to hit the presses.
Mm-hmm. Well, dating and then children. So
Exactly.
it all worked out.
Yeah.
Um, all right, and can you talk a little bit? You touched on this in the passages that you read, but what are some of the most common stereotypes about disabled people and dating that your book challenges?
I think going into it, the stereotypes we really had considered were that people who are disabled don't date or, are sort of like sexless and always the friend, which are different things. And then the other is that disabled people are burdens, that to be with a disabled person in a romantic way is to make a sacrifice. And then writing the book, I not only was debunking those stereotypes, but I was discovering that I had my own stereotypes, which was just that I think I didn't realize before writing the book just how creative disabled people are in relationships and in relationship structures, and then how sexually creative disabled people are, that the spirit of ingenuity that we bring into our daily lives with access and accommodation, like also enters into relationships and into the bedroom. And I think, and that was a way that like my vision of disability really expanded and grew writing the books. Like that so many of the people we interviewed who were ethically not monogamous and had really like complex and interesting relationship structures. Like, well, my body needs this and my partner's neurodivergence needs this. And so we live together at this time, but not this time. And they have another partner. And I was like, oh, this is beautiful to like think about, what do I need? What do you need? And how can we make that work and reject all the assumptions that typically come with relationships? So there were some stereotypes that we went in knowing that were common, and then some that I discovered about myself.
Yeah, for sure. And I really appreciated in the book how you address how there are like ingrained hierarchies that we also have to like fight against within the disabled community. Like that we still perpetuate the hierarchy of like certain body types being less disabled than others and making value judgments about that. Like that was really an impactful part of the book for me as well. And I
Oh, I love
appreciate that you addressed all those different like axes of identity.
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
Um,
glad.
yeah. So I'm really curious about your thoughts on dating apps and how dating apps are not inclusive of the disabled folks, and what ways that they're not inclusive and how they can be improved at time.
Yeah, well, I wrote the chapter on the dating apps, and as part of that, I joined as many dating apps as possible because it had been some time since I'd been on there. And what I was looking for, I mean, joined just like very briefly, uh, but what I was looking for was to see how apps address disability. And what I realized is not a single app mentioned disability or chronic illness at all. And they would have, some of them, there would be like 30 things to select, food choices, animal preferences, height preferences, obviously gender and sexuality, like all of these things. And at no point did it acknowledge that we live in like physical failing bodies. And then when I was talking to disabled people, the question that kept coming up is, at what point do I disclose my disability in the apps? And I was like, well, if the apps presented that opportunity, then it would be much more obvious. And then also it would be so much more normalized that people do have disabilities, that 20% of people dating are disabled or chronically ill. And so to have that totally not represented in these very, very long questionnaires is, I mean, completely discriminatory, and then perpetuates this shame about disclosing this like perfectly natural variation on being a human.
It's such like a simple fix. It's so interesting that it is 2024 and feels so revolutionary. Um, yeah, building on that a little bit, can we talk a little bit about how the media representation fails us so often at capturing the reality of disabled folks and as sexual beings and as people who want to date?
Mute, Caroline.
Mute. I think that my kid is in the next room, and so I keep muting because I'm like, please don't be loud, please don't be loud. And now, it backfires. But from a media perspective, I think one of the things that makes me realize how much I would have wanted this book as a teen and college student and young adult, is how much we're just not in the media. Now it's getting incrementally better, like by whispers better. But for the most part, when you think about sort of rom-coms, stories, novels, like all of these things, the ways that we see relationships occur in all sorts of media, disabled people are almost never part of that at all, like not even considered. And then when we are considered and when we are included, it's sometimes as, an object of sort of mockery, like, one of our favorite comics who is, by and large hysterical, but made this really offhand comment about like, oh my gosh, if you can't walk, you shouldn't reproduce. Or if you don't have, if you have a stump for an arm, you shouldn't get a second date. And everybody's laughing because of course, and it was just like this slap in the face, like, oh my gosh, what just happened? We're sort of part of this dating conversation, and at the same time, just shown how incredibly other we are. And and I think for me, especially as a young person, the message then was, oh, you don't belong in this world. I mean, you're not part of it. Very literally, not on the page, you're not on the screen. And one thing and then where we are included to some degree, there's often an element of sort of pity or tragedy. And what we don't see is just normal, typical day-to-day love, relationships, things where disability is not the main focus of that love story, but just part of it. And I think it's so important because even though media is unrealistic almost by definition, right? Like no one's having sex like that, no one's living like that, no one's dating like that. There's still elements of it where we're sort of visual creatures, or we're auditory creatures, or we're creatures that sort of socialize with other people. And so seeing models of, all right, so this is how two people in wheelchairs hold hands. Here's how they flirt when when they're non-speaking. Seeing those things sort of helps us learn how to do those things. And it normalizes it. It just makes it part of, as Jessica said, like this normal human variation. So what I wish we could see, and hopefully we'll see as the years go on, is disability just being included, you know, on reality TV shows, all of our zillions of dating shows. I wish there were people with disabilities that were amongst those candidates in dating, and things like that, where it's just part of it.
Yeah, for sure. And also in books, and I mean, I'm in a bookstore right now. There are just so few fictional accounts of that include disabled characters where the story isn't just about the disability. Um, and so I'd love to see that expanded hugely. We're making such big strides in diversity in publishing, but I still feel like there's a long way to go in literature.
Sarah, I think about that all the time because I love reading fiction, and none of the characters ever go through their days like I do. None of them are making the same spoon calculations that I'm making or thinking about where they'll charge their wheelchair. And unless it's a book that's about disability advocacy, but I also want to read it in fiction where it's like woven into the
Yeah.
reality of daily life, because that is how disability is woven into
Mhm.
daily life. And yeah, that's something I really want,
I
really
know, I know. I
do.
reckon there's a romance novel called 7 Days in June by Tia Williams, and the main character has chronic pain. But it's just I recommend it all the time because it's not the focus of the book. It's just a very sexy romance. So highly recommend.
Thanks.
Um, so I also, building on representation, also I I think we're all aware of how sex ed is taught in a not inclusive way in schools. I think we're all parents as well, and I am concerned about how the sex ed that my child is going to receive in school is going to be limited and not inclusive. Can we talk about what you would like to see to change that in the future?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is sex ed needs to be taught. So it was sort of horrifying because we approached this as, oh my gosh, we need to have inclusive sex education. And then backing up, it was like, oh my gosh, so few states actually do evidence-based sex ed at all. Of the ones that do, very few, and I don't have the statistics right in front of me, but of the ones that do, very few require it for disabled students. And I would say really none that we saw did anything approaching inclusive sex education. And by inclusive, I mean not only inclusive across the spectrum of gender, gender and sex and things like that, but also looking at sex as more than penetration, sex as something that's broader than sort of heterosexual sort of penetrative sex, and that's done and that addresses the needs of bodies that work in all different ways. And while we can't necessarily address every single aspect of disabled sex or any kind of sex in a sex ed class, I think those basic principles of like, how do you communicate needs? How do you communicate consent when you can't necessarily use words to communicate that? Or and what tools might you use? I think the other thing that's so vitally important is addressing safety concerns, not as a reason not to date, because sometimes I think there is that patronizing sort of protective, like you might get hurt. But the reality is that people with disabilities are far more likely to be victims of sexual violence than non-disabled people. And so I think approaching disabled sex ed and disability in sex ed from that perspective as well of, hey, historically, this has been the case. Here are some of the things that we can do to some tools that you can have to keep yourself safe, both in terms of where you go, how you move, how you communicate with others about where you're going, and the expectation and what constitutes abuse. So in sex ed, I never ever learned that like restricting somebody's access to mobility equipment constitutes abuse, along with the other things that we might more typically think about, restricting access to medications or over medicating. These are things that are despicable and also way too common among disabled people and in interabled relationships. And so just having the language breaks down some of that isolation. And then again, I think just that message of like, you belong here. Like you are, if you choose to, you will engage in sexual activity. You have every right to if you'd like to. And so how does that healthfully, one, you belong, and then what are the sort of rights and responsibilities that go along with that? And even just naming those things, I think would be hugely important for young people, as they're figuring out who they are in the world.
One thing I learned when writing Unfit Parent was that disabled people have unplanned pregnancies more at a greater rate than non-disabled people. And that's because of a lack of sex ed for disabled people and a lack of accessible sex ed. And then also it's standard for when a non-disabled person who has a uterus goes to the doctor and they're an age where they could be pregnant, the doctor will ask, do you think you may or be pregnant? And a disabled person is much less likely to be asked if they're pregnant, because even though we have a higher rate of unplanned pregnancies, the presumption of sexlessness means that doctors don't think we are pregnant. And so the whole thing is backwards and like Caroline mentioned, and it's also a safety issue. Like so many of the people we interviewed for this book had experienced sexual assault, and education doesn't prevent sexual assault. It's not the answer, but it is a answer, and it does, it does improve safety to have knowledge of consent and knowledge of one's body and knowledge of what to ask for and to say no to.
Yeah, and building on that, you talk a little bit about policy in the book. Do you want to expand on what policy changes you would love to see to improve the dating and sex lives of disabled people?
One thing I'll put out, and Jessica, I'll let but the thing that really struck me in writing this was the people's access to Medicaid and healthcare being directly in conflict with their rights to be in a loving partnership. So because of the way that our current medical system works, people who rely on personal assistance for activities of daily living and transportation and things like that, unless you are just extraordinarily wealthy and can pay out of pocket, the way to get those services is through Medicaid. To get Medicaid, you have to have a very, very, very low income and no assets. So if somebody is one, that really impacts your ability to work, for many disabled people, it's like, I want to work, I want to, use my skills, my education. So that's one thing, but it also really impacts your ability to be in a marriage, to marry somebody or to even live with somebody. Because the second that their income, assuming they're working, the second their income gets added to yours, it may strip away the disabled person's ability to access Medicaid. So literally there are people choosing between death and marriage, which is completely bananas, and it's something that's solvable with policy changes. So many things around dating can't be addressed at a policy level. It's like the complexities of human experience, but this is an area that could absolutely be addressed at a policy level. No, Justin.
Yeah, and I think sorry, I did get momentarily distracted because a person walked by the window carrying a boat. But sorry, besides the SSI or your Social Security income and the impact on Medicaid. I think the other policy that ends up being bound up with disability is all the laws being created preventing trans minors from accessing necessary medical care. Writing this book, we address that larger percentage of the autistic population is trans than of the non-autistic population. And, I interviewed some really brilliant trans people and autistic people about their thoughts on that and did a lot of reading. But regardless, and some autistic people consider themselves disabled and some do not. But for those that do consider themselves disabled, anti-trans policies negatively impact access to medical care. I mean, in addition to disabled people not having the funds to access medical care. But those legislation, anti-trans legislation disproportionately also impacts disabled people.
Sorry, I also got distracted because I'm in a glass and the store is all windows and people knock on the window to say hello to me. So thank you so much. And don't forget everyone in the audience, if you have a question for Jessica or Caroline, please put it in the Q&A box. I'll read those aloud in the next few minutes if you have a question.
Yeah, I would love to hear, our favorite part of writing this book was hearing from people and learning from people. So if anyone here has a question or something they'd love to share, I just would really, really love it. So I encourage you to say it. And I think, Sarah, we won't say the names of who the questions are from, right? It's as anonymous as they want it to be.
Yeah, so you can
Okay.
post anonymously for sure. Yeah, while we wait for some questions to come in from the audience, could you just talk about who the audience, like when you were writing the book, who were you writing for? Who did you want to find it?
I think, just because I'm a person by nature, like mostly selfish. When we started the book, I was thinking, what would I have wanted when I was dating, and felt so lonely in that process and felt like no one had made the same decisions I was making. So what do I wish I had? But then as we wrote and we talked to more and more people, my view of what it means to be a disabled person dating, kept expanding and expanding. And so the audience grew and grew. And then we really wanted the book to be as inclusive as possible and include, like I said at the beginning, all of the kind of brilliant and creative ways that disabled people seek out and find love. We wanted it to incorporate, like I said, ethical non-monogamy. We wanted it to talk about people who, asexual people. We wanted to include lots of queer stories. We also, as we talked to disabled people about the sex, we learned that there are a lot of disabled people who practice kink, because like as it was described, this like experimentation with certain BDSM, like this experimentation with pain was sometimes particularly enjoyable for people who experience chronic pain. And I thought learning about that was really, really interesting. And also, so we wanted to include kind of like a broad range of sexual experiences in the book. So the audience for the book kind of grew and grew. And then at the same time, I think we both often felt a little discouraged that we could never write a book for everyone, and that there's such a dearth of books for disabled people, particularly. This is really the first book about disabled dating, that we hope it would be the first of many books, and that other people with other points of view and other specialties could, add to the collection of books about disabled love. Is there anything else you would add, Caroline, to that?
No, I think that really captured. The like quip I was thinking was just like we wrote it for our, the book that we wanted when we were teenagers and didn't realize it, or that I would have wanted as a kid. I think, but it did. It was just it kept expanding out and out. And at the end of the day, one of the things that was surprising was how universal I think it ended up being. It was this book that we wrote for this very specific purpose of that ended up being really, I think, disabled or not, anybody that's curious about how humans connect or who wants to connect, I think could probably feel sort of seen and known in the stories that these people shared.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right, we've got some questions. The first one says, thank you for writing this much needed book. I want to follow up on an earlier comment about when to disclose a disability or illness in the dating process. Since there aren't options in the dating apps, what is appropriate, or what do you think is appropriate?
Caroline, do you want me to start with this one?
Yeah, sure. There was one that's coming up that I was like, oh my gosh, that's so a Jessica question. So go for this one, but you're also going to
Okay.
take that.
Okay. Uh, I mean, I think Caroline, the reason I want to start is we have slightly different views on this. I write in the book about how I didn't disclose my disability on the apps because, the nature of my disability is I have the option not to, and I at that time chose not to, which I have mixed feelings about now, but my husband fully admits that he would not have matched with me if I had disclosed. And I think the unfortunate truth is like we are operating in a highly ableist society. And so my approach was to meet someone and then describe disability and give them a chance to evolve as a person and evolve on what they thought about disability. And, there's a section in the book where I write about what my husband says now and all of his regret of what he would have missed out on. So but I also, I think Caroline's perspective is like, say who you are and you'll get the right people for you by saying who you are. And I think that there's also a strong argument for that. And that worked for her dating. I do think you don't know anyone though. You get to choose what you disclose and when. And I don't think that implies that having a disability or being disabled is a negative trait. It's just a trait about you that you get to choose how and when you talk about it.
And to add one thing onto that too, again, like none of this was prescriptive, it's like people have all different perspectives and they all work, for a variety of people. One thing that we did find that people, I think maybe if you're looking for like one piece of it, traditional advice is, I think people had pretty good luck when they said a sort of a device that they used versus a diagnosis. So, for example, I use crutches versus I have cerebral palsy. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that, probably many of them ableist reasons. But I wonder if one of those reasons is when somebody's met, when you have like a diagnosis like that, any of us, it's a huge spectrum. And so maybe it's like, oh, I know what cerebral palsy is because my cousin has it. Oh, and this kid I went to second grade has it. But neither one of those might be what the person who you're swiping around actually has. And so when people come to it sort of a big idea of like what this might mean or confusion, oh, that sounds really big and messy. You're sort of bringing a lot in there versus, hey, I sometimes walk with a cane or I use a wheelchair. Then it's like a little bit more, it's like you're saying who you are, but there's not as much noise around that necessarily. And so I think when people have been asking for like one piece of thing, I'm like, oh, that's one of the things that I felt like I learned from our conversations with people.
Right. Oh, and then there's also the person I interviewed, and they always say on their profiles, match with me if you're open-minded. And they have good luck with that because then the person, and then over chat, they say they're disabled, and the person is sort of like pressured to being open-minded because they've already like committed a little bit to that. So I also sort of like that approach.
Yeah, that's a good one. The next question is, what surprised you most when doing interviews and research?
Hmm. So do you want me to?
Yeah, you think.
Yeah, do it. All right. So many things. So, I think the thing though that most, so There were a million things that surprised me, and a lot of them had to do with some of the things that Jessica was talking about, with just the vast diversity and creativity and ways that people were adapting sort of relationships to work for them. So that was surprising. But I think the thing that sort of struck the deepest to me was surprising was experiences that I had had thinking that I was the only one were shared by so many people. So there was this sense of like going from isolation and a good deal of shame to, oh my gosh, I'm part of this incredible community of disabled people who are dating, who are, you know, stumbling around in that world, falling, succeeding, all of those things. And then in some ways we've always had these connections and we didn't know it. And so I think that sort of surprise was both delightful. It was also like, oh my gosh, we need to talk more about this. So there was this sense of urgency and really hopeful, you know, and so I've just it's meant a lot to me personally to hear all of those things because I just don't feel as alone anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, what about you, Jessica? What
I think the way disabled people talked about, I know I keep talking about sex, but that was the most surprising for me because I started asking really early in my interviews, how do you define sex? And the definitions that the people I interviewed gave were so beautiful. Like, you know, providing pleasure to another person. You know, it's like it was so far removed from what we've been fed. And I think just like the beautiful creativity of disabled people, I knew it, but to be consistently exposed to it was really beautiful.
Okay. Um, on to the next question. This is from Andrea. She says, my partner and I are having tough conversations about family planning. Given my levels of chronic illness and disability, we are worried about our capacity to raise children, even though we both know we really want to have kids. This is probably a question better suited for your next book, Jessica, but I'd be curious about whether you have any recommendations about navigating this.
Yeah, I just want to take that question so seriously because it's such a big decision for anyone to make to have kids. You know, so many of my friends right now are at the stage where they're deciding yes or no to kids, disabled and not disabled. And, you know, when you have a kid, you just like 100% have a kid. Uh, and this will make me cry, but I will say writing about disabled parents is my favorite thing I've ever done in my life. And disabled parents are so good at figuring out how to make it work. Like the level of daily innovation is absolutely stunning. And I think that so many of the tools that you have developed that help you navigate through daily life with a chronic illness and how to get your body in and out of every day, those skills that you've built, I think they will cross over so remarkably well to the skills you'll need to parent. That I think disabled people are often like particularly well suited to parenting because we have been practicing, I don't know, we've been just practicing dealing with difficult and fragile bodies and minds, and babies are kind of difficult and fragile bodies and minds. And then also like disability in it, you know, in its essence is like this way we have to care for ourselves and this way we have to care for each other. And then parenting, and that's what parenting is too. I mean, I guess this is kind of a flowery answer for like, how can you do it? But there's also details. Like there's a parent I interviewed over and over again for Unfit Parent, and she parents alone day in, day out as a single parent by choice with with almost entirely only using her mouth. And she's a brilliant and incredible mom. And I got to FaceTime with her and witness her in action. And yeah, I think there's a lot of details about how people make it work, but I just think the skills translate over.
Yeah, the beautiful answer got me emotional. Is the next question I think I can answer is your book appropriate for disabled teenagers?
Oh,
What
Sarah, what do you think?
I think so.
Okay.
What did you think?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it depends on the teenager too, right? Like, I mean, I think, if it and your relationship with them maybe, and how much they know already. I think today, I mean, I think teenagers know a lot more today than they did when we were teenagers, potentially. And so I think for some of them, it's like, oh, all of these terms and all of these tools, like I know about it already. So, and I think in that way could be the full book could be really helpful. Depending on, if you're have a teenager in your life who maybe they're just starting out, like you're feeding them information in like bite-sized chunks, then I would say, start with the early chapters on beauty, and like, and moving on up. I think that it's never too early to talk about safety and sexual health. Like you got to talk about that stuff. Whether you want to give them the full list of resources in the back is really up to up to you if you think about like, all right, is this gonna shock or is this gonna help? I don't know. What would you think? What do you think, Jessica?
Um, I don't know, Caroline. I think I play it a little more fast and loose than you do with this kind of stuff. So I'd say like,
Approved.
yeah, tell them all to read it. There's no shame in having bodies and being a person. I think we wrote it carefully. I do. I think it would be appropriate. Um, I think the way we talk about dating and the way we talk about sex is like we're really prioritizing respecting yourself and respecting your partner or partners. And I think that's appropriate.
Yeah.
Awesome. We have a bunch of more questions, so I don't know how long you want to stay on this
Okay.
call. I'm happy to. I have nowhere to go.
I
But
mean, you're at work. You want to go.
um, but we'll start it. We'll have a few more. Um, so actually, Joy, from Access Living, had a question. I would like to hear about your favorite creative access tools or ideas people utilized in sexual relationships.
Ooh.
At the back of the book, there is on page 236 a list of products people recommended to us. And one product that came up, and the list of product names like makes me laugh a lot, but the Liberator wedge did come up a lot as a product that really helped people get in and stay in positions. God, now I'm scared I'm answering like the wrong question. They asked about access tools, sexual relationships. Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
So the
you're good.
Liberator Wedge helps people get in and stay in comfortable positions for sex. And that came up a number of times. And then also something that came up quite a bit were to like think about maybe not having sex only in bed. So a lot of the disabled people we talked to like found that their wheelchair was more comfortable or a recliner chair. Like a few people mentioned recliner chairs to me as like allowing them to get in positions that worked better. And then also something that came up a lot is like I was saying, kind of an expanded definition of sex. So like if someone was experiencing a lot of chronic pain, like being near one another and like talking about sex without actually touching. And so that you have like much more control over your pain level. And like using vibrators or self-touch, that also came up a good bit.
Awesome. And then we had a question from James. Did writing this book change or not change how you approach your romantic relationships in any way that you feel comfortable sharing?
Mm.
I'm happy to answer first, Caroline.
Go for it.
I think writing about caregiving in the book made me think a lot about caregiving in my relationship and made me like consider my own insecurities about the ways that my husband takes care of me. And in addressing that, I realized, oh my gosh, I do so much taking care of him. And it just sort of made me reconsider that balance, like that I had held for so long that whoever was with me was going to be like that there was going to be an imbalance in who was giving and receiving care. And then really thinking about that section sort of, I think, sort of righted the ship a bit in my mind about caregiving.
Yeah, no, I love that too. And it did with me as well, that sense of like, what does mutual dependence look like, interdependence look like in a relationship? And I think it just gave language to things that I'd always sort of felt and recognized, but didn't really have the words for, in terms of like how Kevin and I navigate our lives together. And also, again, like felt less alone. Like sometimes sometimes it felt a little bit like this island, as especially when we first got together, of like, we are two disabled people who found each other, and then realizing like this is not that special, like in the best possible way. Like we're part of this like really vibrant, wonderful community. And so that sense of just like, hey, we're part of this big cohort of disabled adults who were just kind of living our lives, was really lovely. And I think took some of the maybe a little bit internal pressure off, because I still have that kid growing up disabled, like pressure to be perfect, pressure to perform. Everybody has to see how that this is, and it was one more chink away in that armor. So that was a gift.
Right. And then we have another anonymous question. Do you recommend this book for non-disabled people? Are there additional books you all would recommend to non-disabled people as an introduction to disability advocacy?
Uh,
Yeah.
I definitely recommend to non-disabled people. I think everyone could benefit from considering the diversity of bodies, because all bodies will fail, and if you're lucky enough to live long enough, you will become disabled. So I think this book fully applies to everyone.
Yeah. Demystifying Disability
Yeah.
is the other book that is my, when people ask for a good starter, that's always the one that I point to first.
Yeah, it's a brilliant book, and we both are big fans of Emily's.
Yeah.
And it's also available at Women and Children First. Um, and last question that we have time for tonight. How can parents of a disabled person best guide that person through dating?
Ooh, do you want me to take that one first?
Yeah, good.
Um, so I think there's so many different ways that parents can support their disabled, um, you know, teens, young adults as they enter into a dating world. The first thing I think we touched on before, but make sure they have access to sex ed. If the school isn't doing a good job, get your own resources, and there's plenty of them out there, and we can talk about those too. But so age appropriate and age appropriate resources. And if you don't have any for disability, get those resources in particular and make sure your kid has access to them. So that's the first thing, is just like health stuff. The second thing is, I think, making sure your disabled kid is as exposed as possible to any images there are of disabled people living their lives as adults. So one of the things that we really noticed, as part of the children's book, was there are like pretty good representations of kids with disabilities, but then there's just this cliff, and it's like disabled adults don't get represented as much. So I think with parents whose kids are just show like life continues beyond childhood. And then depending on what the person is relying on their parents for. So sometimes parents are doing everything from toileting and bathing to, soup to nuts. And so in those cases, I think the parents have, they do, well, it's probably all of us have varying degrees of comfort about talking to our kids about sex, and the tools they need. I think that they would benefit from having a frank conversation about that and saying like, hey, I'm going to give you some materials. And if there's any of these things that you feel like you would want access to, I will, help you with that access or find somebody who can access that. And then parents have a huge amount of investment in their kids, especially I think parents of disabled kids, where many of them have been tireless and fierce advocates for, some sense of equality and inclusion from the time their kids were very little. And so then people get to the point where they got to kind of drop the reins a little bit because all people need to differentiate a bit and to separate from their parents. And sometimes for parents of disabled teens, that can be real tough because it's like, oh, I've protected you. And now you get into dating, which is inherently vulnerable. It's most of the time it's not going to work. And then parents may have a real hard time letting those reins go or being a little too directive. And so I think, as a parent doing that gut check of like, is my kid equipped to go out there and sort of fail, like fail at this or get hurt? Hopefully they've given the tools for the bigger safety things, but can I let my kid grow and develop as people naturally do? And so, and if you're, if as a parent you're having trouble with that, finding somebody to talk to outside of your kid, like I always recommend therapy. I'm like, therapy's great, but as you're supporting your kid making those transitions. Um,
All right. I think that is our show. That was so wonderful. And thank you to our audience members for your wonderful questions. That was a fantastic conversation and it felt collaborative in a beautiful way. Thank you so much, Jackie. I'm so sorry that went long. Thank you for providing ASL interpretation. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you to our captioner, Joe. You're incredible. And thank you to Access Living and Joy for co-sponsoring this event and making it accessible. And thank you to our authors, Caroline and Jessica. Dateable is available now on Women and Children First or your favorite independent bookstore, wherever you're watching. And we ship anywhere in the United States as well. Yeah, any last final words or before we sign off?
No, thank you all for being here. This was so wonderful. I'm really thankful for everyone who came and for all the questions.
Yeah.
I so appreciate it. Thank you for hosting and thank you all for being here and making time for this.
And those of you who know people who could not join us live, this will be available as a recording at womenandchildrenthirst.com on our recordings page. Thank you so much. Have a beautiful night. Thank you.
Thanks
You
all.
too. Good night.